Okay, Graham, so it seems to me that a linchpin of the Christian faith and the Christian worldview is the resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
And indeed, St. Paul himself, says, look, if Christ is not raised, then we're to be more pitied than all men.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, it's frequently an area of Christianity that comes in for focused attention and criticism.
Mm-hmm.
What would you feel are the main positive reasons for believing that Jesus of Nazareth really did rise from the dead?
I think what we need to consider is that the Gospels, and again, there's a strong consensus on this. I mean, there's really very little doubt about this. The Gospels were certainly written within a generation of Jesus' ministry. So you're talking about a period of time when Jesus could have lived out his natural life if he hadn't been crucified. So there's really nobody out there who's denying that there are good historical facts in the Gospels. When Richard Dawkins, he tweeted recently, did Jesus exist? Who cares? Was he the Son of God? Obviously not, or words to that effect. And you're looking at this statement, did Jesus exist? Who cares? And you're thinking, this is a man who changed history. Would you have mentioned that about Julius Caesar? Would you have mentioned this about Hannibal? We're talking about a significant figure in history. This matters a lot. This isn't a case of who cares. We do need to know about him. And I think that just says a lot about Dawkins' attitude to any subject that takes him outside of his laboratory or lack of laboratory, however he works. But if we come on to the evidence in the Gospels, I wouldn't be asking anybody to say, believe the resurrection because the Gospels are generally reliable documents or partially reliable documents and they have a resurrection in them. But saying, let's look at what the Gospels say and let's look at how historians examine the Gospels. Let's take what they consider to be good information. Let's look at facts that we all can agree on. And then let's see if a case can be built out of that for Jesus' resurrection. So let's go towards the end of Jesus' life. Generally, historians will want to say that any information that's embarrassing to the Christian community that's information that they wouldn't make up. And information that fits the social context of the time, particularly anybody who fits the context of Palestine in the first century. That's good historical information. So let's start with the crucifixion of Jesus. Nobody doubts that, not only because it appears outside of the Gospels, but because why would anybody make up that their Messiah was crucified? You were crucified. It's a shameful death. It was meant to be shameful, not painful. These are people who live without aspirin. These are people who were used to living without antiseptics, without antibiotics. Pain was not the big thing to them. Shame, now that's something different. Shame where you're hung up naked to die. That's a problem. So nobody's going to invent a shameful death. And we know that other characters who with messianic pretensions who were put to death in and around the time, their movements died out. Jesus didn't. So there's a question here. Richard Dawkins aside, it's not a case of who cares. What's different here? What's different about this man, Jesus Christ? So we're all agreed he died by crucifixion. He had been given an honourable burial. And this is part of the Gospels that we can agree, the historians can be confident in, because it would have been up to the Sanhedrin who had sentenced Jesus to death to bury him, and to bury him honourably, and to bury him quickly, because if a executed man is left out overnight, according to Jewish law, according to the Torah, this pollutes the land. So they've got to bury this body. So the fact that a member of the Sanhedrin buried Jesus' body, that's something that the church wouldn't be particularly keen to make up. Member of the Sanhedrin, they're supposed to be the bad guys in this story. He's burying him. But it also fits the context. A member of the Sanhedrin would have had that job. Let's get these bodies away. Let's get them down. So we know he was buried in a tomb. The church goes out of its way to advertise where the tomb is. If you're in and around Jerusalem at the time, you'd have known. Remember the Sanhedrin, like being a member of Parliament. They advertise where this tomb is. And then the first thing that I really want to stress is that this tomb is empty the next morning because of the amount of embarrassing information that comes up. Women discover this tomb. These are misogynist times. Very misogynist. Jesus stood up against it. Woman's word is no good in court. Why not have Peter come heroically to the tomb? Why not have some other, invent a character? I mean, if this is all mythology, if this is all invented, you would make up some heroic story of some important apostle. Why not throw Paul in there? If you're making this up after Jesus' death, why not throw Paul in? But we don't. We've got these two women, or a group of women, coming to the tomb, discovering that it's empty. The Gospel of Mark actually ending, it seems, with these women being terrified, not really knowing what's going on. This isn't a story that somebody's made up to make the church look heroic. You sometimes on atheist blogs get people saying very foolish things, like the Gospel of Mark, the original ending didn't have a resurrection, and ignoring in Mark chapter 8 and two other occasions Jesus said, I'm going to die and rise again, and you're going to see me again. It ends with an empty tomb. I think the writer of Mark assumes some intelligence on the reader's part to work out what had happened. And the point is, the very point Mark's making is you the reader, know what's going on. Well, the early church, they were a bit clueless, weren't they? So, the Christians are almost having to admit quite a bit here that the story would say, look, that looks accurate. But another really, interesting fact to me is that in the book of Matthew, they have to respond to this charge that the disciples stole the body. And that's something that the church would not have wanted to admit to. As Craig Keener mentions in his book on the historical Jesus, that grave robbers were associated with witchcraft. And this was a Jewish complaint about Jesus. He was a sorcerer who deluded God's people. This seems to be a Jewish tradition that goes back some time. And so the disciples, by saying, having to admit this charge, they have to admit this charge and put it in one of their Gospels because it's such a serious charge. Something they wouldn't have wanted to do, but they have to respond to it. And what's important about that is it shows us one crucial fact that both sides are agreed on. That tomb was empty. The people who were living in and around the time of Jesus' life, and in Jerusalem, where the early church started, they were all agreed the tomb was empty. Stories weren't travelling around saying, they made it up or buried him out in the sand. If the disciples were inventing the story of the empty tomb later on, don't invent a tomb. Don't invent a member of the Sanhedrin. Don't do that. You would say, we buried his body in a ditch, and when we came back to the ditch was empty. Anybody could fabricate that story. But they made this story is easy to check, easy to verify. And how on earth does the early church, which starts in Jerusalem, everybody's agreed it starts in Jerusalem. James Dunn, a second part of his three-part history of Christianity, the history of the early church, part 2, beginning from Jerusalem. Starts in Jerusalem. How does that early church manage to preach in Jerusalem if the body was still in the tomb? So the tomb was empty. There doesn't seem to be any doubt here. Now, I also know at this stage I've said nothing miraculous. Nothing miraculous about an empty tomb. So we should accept that's an accepted part of history. Well, then we come to the appearances. And again, no doubt about the appearances. Nobody disputes that there were appearances. People now try and say they were psychological events. People try to say that that maybe they were visions, and they come up with all sorts of attempts to explain the appearances of Jesus. But we need those because we need to get from a defeated, despondent group of disciples on Good Friday to a group that, within a period of 30 days, has started a movement that causes great upset in Jerusalem, causes great upset eventually in the Roman world. I mean, how does that happen? What changed these guys? What changed these early movers of Christianity? What changed them? You can't explain early Christianity without explaining the leaders. So what changed those leaders? So that, the visions aren't under dispute. They said there were visions. They claimed that they had seen them. Then we come to this other fact. They used this term resurrection. Now, resurrection, and again, strong consensus on this. Even from members of the Jesus Seminar, resurrection does not mean ghost, does not mean angel. Resurrection means dead body, body alive again, and not like Lazarus dies, he rises, but eventually Lazarus would grow old and die. Resurrection, to use C.S. Lewis's term, means to go through death and come out the other side. Resurrection means judged by God, body that belongs to the new heavens and the new earth. Even saying that sounds strange, even today. You need to think in those terms. Yet these disciples said that we just didn't see a raised person, we seen a resurrected person. We've seen somebody who had died, who had risen again, and he was resurrected. What convinced them that somebody had resurrected? Because there were all sorts of ways that they could have described Jesus' life after death. They could have said that we've seen Jesus' angel. They could have said we've seen a vision of Jesus, and we know that one day he'll return on a throne, or one day he'll return. He's in heaven now. His body's in the ground, but one day he'll return and be resurrected with the rest of us. They could have said that Jesus was a star in the sky. That was an option. Jesus had all sorts of ways of conceiving life after death. Instead, they come up with this idea that this man was resurrected. Now, when you put those facts together, and again, standard atheist response, if you go on to particularly new atheist response, would be people make up crazy stories all the time. Okay, I'll agree with that. Yeah, people do. So there's nothing unhistorical in saying that the first Christians believed in a resurrection. There's nothing, and they should accept that. The evidence there is as good as it's going to get. No reason for denying, and very, very good reasons for accepting, and a strong consensus that there were visions of Jesus after he was. So we've got visions that convince people he was resurrected, and you add that together with an empty tomb. Now we've got evidence that you've got to explain. And you can't just say, who cares? You can't just say, it's silly. This is important. We're talking about the history of civilization around the globe. Christianity is not just a Western affair. It stretches out into China in its first centuries, goes into India. You can't just ignore this. What happened? Now, if there's a God, resurrection's an option. As a matter of fact, resurrection seems to be the only option. The only attempts that really, there are lots of conspiracy theories, and this is important. Some people would say historians can't talk about resurrection. Historians can't talk about miracles. Any other explanation would work. Well, that's not true. David Frederick Strauss really came down very hard on the ludicrous explanations that people came up for miracles in the Bible. Some of them are fantastic. They talk about Jesus feeding the 5,000, and the reason that he was able to feed the 5,000 is because there were a group of Essenes in a cave behind him who were passing out the loaves. Some other day said that Jesus was able to walk on water because his disciples had carefully placed planks beneath it. And Strauss at this stage said, no, you can't have that because it's easier to believe there was a miracle. But he says, but we can say it was a myth. That was his way out. But what if it's improbable? What if it just doesn't seem likely that this was a myth? What if the stories just don't fit the hypothesis of myth? And that's what I'm saying about the empty tomb. It just doesn't fit that hypothesis. It just doesn't fit that explanation. The story of an empty tomb just does not seem like a story that somebody would make up if you were trying to start a church. It's the opposite. It's got all these embarrassing details. The stories of the resurrection appearances, they're just so strange. They cohere in the main points. There was a bodily resurrection, yet they're even reading them today, and reading the stories you seem familiar with, you read them again, and there's just so much of this that these people were struggling to explain. And you put all this together, this wasn't myth. So you can either shrug your shoulders, along with Richard Dawkins' tweet, and say, who cares? Or you can start to try and answer the question. And that's that's really where, as a teacher, what I want people to do is to sit down and think. It's not good enough to say people make up crazy stories all the time. That's true. People do make up crazy stories all the time. Most people are accused of murder, get put away. Now and then somebody's innocent. There's lots of crazy stories out there. That doesn't mean that now and then a story that initially seems crazy mightn't have a grain of truth. That's how we make progress. That's how we learn things. You look for the thing that just defies explanation. There's just a bit of grit in the oyster. And you want to make something out of that. And that's what I would want my students to do. I'd want them to sit down with a difficult, awkward set of facts and say, what's the explanation? And if that takes you to a new place where you've got to start believing in God and believing in Christianity, then, well, that suits me.